Hey, welcome back to Nightfall Lore. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and settle in, because tonight we're doing something we've never attempted before on this channel. We're going all the way back, past the dragons of Skyrim, past the Oblivion Crisis, past the founding of the Septim Empire, past even the first mortal footstep on Tamriel. Tonight we're telling the complete story of the Elder Scrolls universe, from the moment before time existed to the moment a Dragonborn hero stood atop the throat of the world and ended an age. Before we start, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments if you're still awake enough to type. Maybe you're winding down after a long shift. Maybe you're driving through a quiet stretch of highway with this playing low. Maybe you're already halfway into sleep with your phone propped against a pillow. Wherever you are, whatever corner of the world you're tucked into right now, I'm glad you're here for this one, because this is the big one. This is the whole story. The world of Tamriel has one of the strangest, most philosophically dense creation myths in all of fiction. It isn't a simple tale of a god snapping their fingers and making a world. It's a story about a wound, a story about a god who sacrificed his own divinity to build something that was never meant to exist, and about the beings who have spent every age since arguing over whether that sacrifice was a gift or a crime. Every war, every empire, every hero we've covered on this channel, Tiber Septim, the Dragonborn, the Nerevarine, all of it traces back to this one act of defiance at the dawn of everything. A lot of you have watched our deep dives into individual figures on this channel. Tonight is the opposite kind of experience entirely. Tonight we're zooming all the way out, stretching across roughly the same amount of narrative territory as the entire mainline Elder Scrolls series combined, from the earliest, half-mythical rumours of the Merethic era all the way through the province of Skyrim in the modern 4th era. If you've played through Morrowind, Oblivion or Skyrim, you already know fragments of tonight's story, scattered across loading screens and dusty books shelved in forgotten libraries. What we're doing tonight is threading every one of those fragments into a single, continuous narrative, so you can finally hear the whole shape of it, start to finish, in one sitting. So tonight, we're doing the full timeline. We'll move through the Dawn era, the Merethic era, the First era, the Second era, the Third era, and finally the Fourth era, watching the mortal races rise, the empires fall, and the gods themselves bleed into the world they built. This is a long one, easily the longest video we've ever put together. So if you drift off partway through, don't worry. I'll still be here talking when you wake up for a moment, and I'll be here again tomorrow night if you need to pick up where you left off. One more thing before we begin. If you're new here, welcome. Nightfall Lore exists for exactly this purpose. Long, calm and deeply researched lore narration designed to help you unwind and drift off while still learning something. If that sounds like your kind of channel, consider sticking around. Now let's rewind everything. Let's go back to Before There Was a Before. Chapter 1, Before Time Was Time. To understand the Elder Scrolls universe, you have to first understand that in the beginning, there was no beginning. Not in the way we think of one. Before Tamriel, before the gods, before even the concept of a place for anything to happen, there was only a formless, timeless void called the Orbis, and within it existed exactly two things, Anu and Padomay. Anu represented stasis, permanence, the unchanging. Padomay represented change, chaos, motion, the restless force that refuses to sit still. These two were not gods in the way we'll come to understand gods later in the story. They were closer to raw concepts, primal forces locked in eternal tension, existing before existence itself had rules. And their interaction, their friction, their endless push and pull against one another is what generated everything that would eventually become the universe we know. From the clash between Anu and Padomay came time itself, a concept that hadn't existed before their collision. And from that first spark of time came a flood of other beings, spirits born from the interplay of stasis and chaos. These beings are called the Et Ada, which translates roughly to original spirits, and they are the ancestors of every god, every Daedra, and eventually every mortal race that would come to populate the world. Now here's where the story starts to get its philosophical teeth. The Et Ada split into two camps, mirroring their parents. Some of them lean toward the nature of Anu, drawn toward permanence, order, and eventually the idea of building something lasting. These spirits would become known as the Aedra, and the word itself means our ancestors in the ancient Elven tongue. Others lean toward Padomay, embracing change, chaos, and endless transformation without the burden of consequence. These became the Daedra, meaning not our ancestors, or more loosely, our brothers who chose differently. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in Elder Scrolls lore, because it defines the entire moral and cosmological structure of the universe going forward. The Aedra are the ones who eventually sacrifice a piece of themselves to create the mortal world. The Daedra are the ones who refuse to make that sacrifice, choosing instead to remain in their own eternal, unchanging planes of oblivion, ruling as princes over realms shaped entirely by their own will and personality. Neither side is purely good or purely evil. The Aedra gave up their immortal perfection for something that could grow and change and eventually die, which is either the most generous act imaginable or the cruelest trick ever played on the beings who would be born from it, depending on which philosopher in Tamriel you happen to ask. The Daedra, meanwhile, are often cast as villains and tempters throughout the games, but their refusal to sacrifice themselves is also, in a strange way, a refusal to be diminished. They kept their divinity intact. They just never got to have a world of their own the way the Aedra eventually would. Among these early spirits, a handful stand out as central to everything that follows. There's Magnus, a being deeply tied to magic and the raw creative energy of the universe, who would later play a crucial and tragic role in the shaping of Mundus. There's Auriel, who mortals would eventually come to know as Akatosh, the god of time itself, the most revered of all the Aedra by the Elven and later human civilizations. And there's a strange, restless, ambitious spirit named Lorkhan. Lorkhan is, without exaggeration, the single most important figure in the entire cosmology of the Elder Scrolls. Depending on the culture telling the story, he's remembered under different names. The Aldmer call him Lorkhan and treat him with deep suspicion and resentment. The Nords call him Shor and honour him as a trickster hero god. The Red Guards call him Sep and curse his name. But in every version of the myth, Lorkhan is the architect of the plan that leads to the creation of the mortal world, and it's a plan that none of the other Etiada asked for. Before Lorkhan's scheme, the Orbis was populated entirely by these spirit beings existing in a kind of eternal, timeless dance. There was no physical world, no sun, no soil, no mortals, just the endless, echoing void of Aetherius, the plane where the Aedra-aligned spirits dwelled, contrasted against Oblivion, the churning, ever-shifting realm claimed by the Daedra. Lorkhan looked at this arrangement and decided it wasn't enough. He wanted something new. He wanted a physical realm, a place with substance and consequence, and he began quietly, patiently, convincing other spirits to help him build it. This is where our story truly begins, because what Lorkhan proposed wasn't a gift freely given. It was closer to a con. He whispered to the other Etaida, painting a picture of a magnificent new creation, a plane of existence unlike anything that had come before, and he conveniently left out the price of admission. That price was a piece of each spirit's own divine essence. To build the physical world, the gods would have to bleed a portion of their immortality into it, weakening themselves forever in exchange for bringing this new realm into being. Some for the Etiada refused immediately once they understood the cost. These spirits remained fully divine, fully unattached to the coming creation, and many of them became, or remained, Daedra, content to rule their own separate realms rather than fracture themselves for Lorkhan's ambitious project. But many others were persuaded, whether by curiosity, by loyalty to one another, or simply by being swept up in the momentum of the scheme before they fully understood what they were agreeing to. And so, spirit by spirit, sacrifice by sacrifice, the greatest and strangest act of creation in this entire universe began to unfold. And at the centre of it all was a broken god who would soon come to regret ever having a heart to give. Chapter 2: The Towers and the Broken God. The actual creation of Mundus, the physical world that would eventually hold Tamriel, was not a peaceful process. It was closer to a slow-motion catastrophe, a birth that nearly killed everyone involved. Magnus, the spirit most closely tied to magical energy and light, became one of the primary architects of this new plane, alongside Lorkhan. Together, and with the contribution of countless other Etelaida who gave up pieces of themselves, they began weaving the raw substance of Mundus into being. But almost immediately something went wrong. The process was more costly, more draining, more genuinely dangerous than most of the participating spirits had anticipated. Creating a physical world with actual matter, actual time, actual mortality baked into its foundation required an almost unthinkable expenditure of divine energy. Magnus, watching this cost spiral far beyond what he was willing to pay, made a decision that would echo through every era of Tamrielic history. He fled. He abandoned the project mid-creation, tearing a hole in the fabric of the newly forming world as he escaped back toward Aetherius, and through that tear, magic itself began leaking out of Mundus and back into the ether from which it came. That tear in reality became the sun, not a literal ball of fire in the way we might picture it, but a permanent scar, a wound in the sky through which magical energy continuously bleeds out of the world and back into the heavens. Every sunrise in Tamriel is, in the lore, a reminder of a god fleeing his own unfinished creation. Magnus wasn't entirely without conscience, though. As he left, he offered the other participating spirits a choice: follow him back to Aetherius and abandon the project, keeping their divinity fully intact, or remain behind and continue the work of building Mundus, staying tethered to the physical world they were creating. Some spirits took him up on the offer to leave immediately. Others chose to stay a while longer, continuing to shape the world before eventually finding their own paths back to the ether. But a select group of spirits made a far more permanent decision. They chose to remain within Mundus entirely, binding themselves to specific locations, becoming what are known in the lore as the Magna G, and later, more famously, the Towers. The Towers are one of the most important and most complicated concepts in all of Elder Scrolls cosmology, and honestly, entire dedicated videos could be made just unpacking them. In simple terms, a tower is a physical structure, ancient and often nearly indestructible, that acts as an anchor point tethering Mundus to the underlying structure of creation itself. The first and most fundamental of these was the Adamantine Tower, built by the Aedra as a kind of keystone holding the newly formed world together. Later, towers would rise across Tamriel, each one associated with different cultures, different gods, and different metaphysical principles, but all of them serving in one way or another as load-bearing pillars of reality. The White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil, later home to the Imperial City, is perhaps the most famous of these in the games most players have actually experienced. Ancient Ayleid ruins, the Crystal Tower of the Somerset Isles, the Snow Throat that would become the Throat of the World in Skyrim, these are all towers in one form or another, each one whispered about in mythology as places of immense metaphysical significance. While Magnus fled and the other spirits scattered or settled, Lorkhan remained fully committed to his project, pushing forward with the creation of Mundus, even as the cost mounted and resentment among the other Et Aida grew sharper. The world he and his collaborators built was raw, unstable, and only partially formed, a swirling proto-reality that lacked the coherence needed to support actual living, breathing mortal creatures. It needed something more. It needed order imposed upon it, structure carved into its chaotic foundations, and crucially, it needed a heart. This is where Lorkhan committed the act that would define his legacy for every age to follow. He took a fragment of his own divine essence, the very core of himself, and planted it at the centre of Mundus, using it as a kind of engine to stabilise the fledgling world and breathe the first true spark of life into it. This fragment became known as the Heart of Lorkhan, and its placement at the centre of the world was, depending on your cultural and philosophical lens, either the single greatest act of creation in the history of the universe, or the most monstrous betrayal ever committed against the other gods. Because here's the thing, many of the other Aedra came to believe once the dust settled and Mundus finally stabilised into something resembling the world we know. They felt tricked. Lorkhan had convinced them to sacrifice pieces of themselves for a project he framed as a shared, glorious undertaking. But in the end, it was his own heart, his own sacrifice, that truly anchored the whole thing into existence. The other gods gave up power and received nothing but a diminished, weakened state in return, forever bound to a physical world that would eventually be populated by short-lived, flawed, mortal creatures who would barely understand the sacrifice made on their behalf. The resentment toward Lorkhan among many of the Aedra, particularly among the Aldmeri gods, became so severe that, according to Elven myth, they eventually cornered him, tore the heart from his chest, and cast both the heart and Lorkhan's body out of the world entirely. Lorkhan's spirit was said to have been flung from Mundus, landing eventually beneath the region that would become Red Mountain in Morrowind, where his heart would go on to play a devastating role thousands of years later in the story of the Dwemer. His body, meanwhile, according to Nordic myth, was said to have been used by the god Shor's own people to forge the moons, or in other tellings, his corpse became the very ground the mortal races would eventually walk upon. There's a broader philosophical framework that Elder Scrolls scholars, both in-universe and in the real-world fandom, have spent years picking apart, centred on a concept called the Wheel, and in more esoteric texts the idea of Anuel and Sithis as the truer, purer names for Anu and Padomay, before they took on more personal mythologized identities. Some of the deepest, most dangerous magical philosophy in this setting revolves around a school of thought known as the Sigic Endeavour, or more infamously, the teachings that would later inspire the Mythic Dawn cult we'll meet much later tonight, both of which orbit the unsettling idea that Mundus itself is fundamentally a mistake, an unfinished, corrupted deviation from the pure, unified state that existed before Anu and Padomay ever collided, and that the truest form of enlightenment lies in somehow unmaking the physical world and returning everything to that original, undivided stillness. It's a genuinely bleak thread running underneath the surface of this entire cosmology, the idea that creation itself might be understood, by certain philosophies within the setting, as a kind of cosmic wound rather than a gift. And it's a thread that resurfaces again and again as we move through tonight's story, particularly once we reach the Aldmeri Dominion and their own long-term theological goals many thousands of years later. whatever the precise details, whichever cultural myth you subscribe to, the through line remains the same. A god sacrificed himself to build a world, was punished for it by his peers, and left behind a wound at the centre of creation that would never fully heal. Every mortal race that eventually rises across Tamriel, and every war fought over divinity, magic and power throughout this story, traces its roots back to this one broken, bleeding heart buried deep beneath the earth, and it's with that heart still pulsing beneath the mountains that the first true inhabitants of this new world finally began to stir. Chapter 3. The Old Elnofe Awaken. With Mundus finally stabilised, however imperfectly, the stage was set for the first mortal-adjacent beings to walk its surface. These earliest inhabitants are collectively referred to in the lore as the Elnofi, a term that essentially means earthbones or people of the earth, and they represent the primordial ancestors of both the Elven and, eventually through a stranger and more complicated route, the human races of Tamriel. The Elnofe were not quite gods and not quite mortals. They existed in a liminal space between the two, beings who had descended fully into the physical world Lorkhan and the others had built, taking on forms that were far more tangible and earthbound than the spirit beings who had merely shaped Mundus from a distance. According to the oldest surviving texts, a massive cataclysmic event known as the Void Nights, or the Sundering, occurred not long after Mundus formed, an event so catastrophic it physically tore the original supercontinent apart, splitting the Elnofe population and scattering them across two very different landmasses. One group ended up on a continent that would eventually become Tamriel. The other ended up on a separate continent far to the north called Aldmer. This split matters enormously because the two groups of Elnofi followed drastically different evolutionary and cultural paths from this point forward. The Elnofe who remained on the Tamrielic continent would gradually transform into the Mir, the Elven races. The Elnofe who ended up on Aldmer would eventually transform into the ancestors of men, the human races who would, thousands of years later, sail south and settle in Tamriel themselves, setting up one of the great foundational conflicts of the setting, elf versus man, a divide that echoes through nearly every war covered on this channel, from the earliest slave rebellions to the Great War of the Fourth Era. Let's stay with the Tamrielic branch of the Elnofe for now, because they're the first to develop into a recognisable civilization. Over time, isolated from their Atmaran cousins, this population began to change, physically and culturally, into what would become known as the Aldmer, or Elder Folk. The Aldmer are in essentially every sense the mother culture of every Elven race that exists anywhere in Tamriel by the time the games we've covered on this channel take place. Every Altmer, every Bosmer, every Dunmer, every Orc traces their bloodline back to this single ancestral Elven civilization. The Aldmer settled primarily on a landmass known as the Somerset Isles, off the western coast of the Tamrielic continent, and there they built what many texts describe as the first true civilization in the mortal world. This was the Merethic era, an age so ancient and so poorly documented that even the scholars within the setting itself openly admit most of what they know about it is closer to educated guesswork stitched together from fragmented myths, conflicting oral traditions, and archaeological ruins scattered across Tamriel. The word Merethic literally comes from a root meaning mythic, a small but telling admission from the in-universe historians that this entire era exists more as legend than as verified fact. During this period, the Aldmer developed sophisticated magical practices, a deep religious devotion to the Aedric gods, particularly Auriel, and a cultural identity built heavily around the idea of purity, permanence, and a kind of aristocratic disdain for anything they viewed as lesser or unrefined. This cultural DNA, this obsession with hierarchy and elven superiority, doesn't fade away as the eras progress. It becomes one of the most persistent threads running through the entire history of Tamriel, resurfacing again and again, most dramatically in the Fourth Era with the rise of the Thalmor, whom we'll get to much later tonight. As Aldmer civilization grew and expanded outward from the Somerset Isles onto the broader Tamrielic mainland, tensions began to emerge within their own society. Not every Aldmer agreed with the increasingly rigid religious and cultural direction their civilization was taking. Some among them grew uncomfortable with the worship of the Aedra, particularly given the uncomfortable philosophical question sitting at the heart of Aldmer theology. If the Aedra sacrificed themselves to create Mundus, and are in effect slowly dying across the ages as their power continues to drain into the world, doesn't that make Mundus itself something closer to a grave? Doesn't that make mortal existence itself a kind of parasitic afterthought, feeding on the corpse of dying gods? This philosophical discomfort, combined with more mundane political and territorial disputes, eventually splintered Aldmer society into competing factions. Some Aldmer began migrating away from the Somerset Isles entirely, spreading out across the Tamrielic mainland and gradually diverging culturally and even physically from their kin who remained behind. Over enough centuries, these migrating populations would transform into entirely distinct elven races. It's worth pausing here and letting that sink in for a moment as we drift further into this ancient history together. Every elven culture we know from the games, the proud and scholarly Aldmer of Somerset, the wild and nature-bound Bosmer of Valenwood, the once great and now tragic Dwemer of Morrowind, they all descend from this single, splintering ancient migration, born from disagreements about faith, purpose, and the true meaning of Lorkhan's sacrifice. During this same stretch of the Merethic era, the Aldmer also developed what would become one of the most important magical and political institutions in the entire setting. A body of powerful, reclusive mages who withdrew from mainstream Aldmer society to study magic in near-total isolation on Artaeum, a hidden island shrouded from the rest of Tamriel by ancient enchantment. These mages became known as the Psijic Order, and although they rarely intervene directly in the events of the wider world, their quiet influence threads through nearly every major turning point we'll cover tonight, nudging history in one direction or another from behind a veil most mortals never even realise is there. The Psijic Order's founding also marks one of the first moments in this story where a faction of elves explicitly chose neutrality and observation over conquest or cultural expansion, a philosophy that would set them apart from nearly every other Aldmer successor culture for the rest of Tamrielic history. It's worth sitting with the concept of the towers for just a moment longer before we move forward, because it resurfaces again and again across tonight's story, sometimes quietly, sometimes as the direct centerpiece of an entire crisis. Each tower, in its own way, represents a kind of load-bearing wall holding up the structure of reality itself, and throughout Tamrielic history, whenever a tower is threatened, damaged, or deliberately manipulated, the consequences tend to ripple far beyond the immediate region around it. The throat of the world, the tallest mountain in all of Tamriel, and one we'll return to later tonight when we reach the story of the Dragonborn, is itself considered one of these ancient towers, its peak so thoroughly saturated with primordial creation energy that it remains, thousands of years later, one of the few places in the mortal world still capable of housing the Greybeard's ancient, contemplative order and their mastery of the voice. Understanding the towers as a kind of skeleton holding Mundus together helps explain why so many of the pivotal events across this entire cosmology, the theft of Numidium, the shattering of the Amulet of Kings, the eruption of Red Mountain, all circle back in one way or another to these same ancient anchor points scattered across the map. And so, as the Merethic era stretched on for thousands upon thousands of years, the map of Tamriel slowly began filling in. Elven kingdoms rose in the west, in the deep forests, and in the northeastern reaches of the continent. Ancient magic saturated the land, and far to the north, on the frozen shores of Atmora, another branch of the Elnafey, the ancestors of men, were beginning their own long cold journey toward a very different kind of civilization, one that would eventually cross the sea and change the fate of the entire continent forever. Chapter 4: The Sundering of the Mer. As Aldmer's civilization matured on the Somerset Isles, the philosophical and political fractures we touched on a moment ago deepened into something far more permanent. This period, sometimes referred to as the Sundering of the Aldmer or simply the Great Scattering of the Elven peoples, represents one of the most consequential cultural splits in the entire history of Tamriel, and it's worth slowing down here, letting your breathing settle, as we trace how one people became many. The first major group to break away were the Aldmer, who rejected what they saw as increasingly hollow, ritualistic worship of the Aedra back on Somerset. Led by mystic and philosophical factions who believed the Aedra had, in essence, doomed themselves and their followers by sacrificing divinity for a decaying physical world, these dissenting Aldmer migrated eastward across Tamriel, eventually settling in the region that would become Morrowind. There, guided by prophetic figures who had come to be revered as the Tribunal and influenced heavily by Daedric worship, particularly devotion to the Daedric prince Boethia, this population transformed culturally and eventually physically into the Chimera, the changed folk. The Chimera built a civilization defined by fierce independence, ancestor worship, and a deep philosophical rejection of Aldmeri orthodoxy. Centuries later, following a cataclysmic magical event we'll touch on shortly, the Chimera would transform once more, this time into the Dwemer, the Dark Elves, whose descendants populate Morrowind to this very day. A separate group of Aldmer, drawn instead toward the deep ancient forests covering much of western Tamriel, settled in the region that would become Valenwood. Over countless generations, exposed to the wild, primal magic of the forest itself, this population transformed into the Bosmer, the Wood Elves. Bosmer culture developed around a sacred and binding pact with the forest spirit Y'ffre, known as the Green Pact, an oath that forbade them from harming plant life for sustenance, forcing their culture toward hunting, and in the most extreme traditional interpretations, toward the consumption of their own fallen enemies rather than violating the sanctity of the woods around them. Yet another offshoot of the Aldmer, one that stayed closest, geographically and culturally, to their ancestral home on Somerset, would become the Altmer, the High Elves, the direct cultural and philosophical heirs of the original Aldmer civilization. The Altmer maintained the strictest devotion to Aedric worship, the deepest belief in Elven cultural superiority, and would go on to become, across nearly every era of Tamrielic history, one of the most politically dominant and at various points most antagonistic forces on the entire continent. There's one more tragic branch of this Elven family tree that deserves real attention here, because it's one of the more heartbreaking threads in the entire lore. A group of ancient Aldmer, predating even some of these other splits, settled deep within what would become Skyrim, worshipping the goddess Auriel with a purity and devotion that bordered on the fanatical. These were the ancient Falmer, often called the Snow Elves, and for thousands of years they built a proud, radiant civilization across the northern reaches of Tamriel. But when the ancestors of men eventually crossed from Atmora and began settling in Skyrim themselves, a devastating and prolonged war broke out between the Snow Elves and the invading Nordic tribes. The Snow Elves were eventually crushed, their king was slain, their capital destroyed, and their surviving population, broken and desperate, made a fateful decision. They sought aid from the Dwemer, the deep elves who had built vast subterranean civilizations beneath the mountains of Skyrim and Morrowind. The Dwemer agreed to help, but the price was catastrophic. Using dark, twisted magic, the Dwemer transformed the surviving snow elves into a permanently blinded, degraded subterranean race, stripping away their beauty, their culture, their very elven dignity, and turning them into servile creatures bound to Dwemer society. This is the tragic, horrifying origin of the Falmer we encounter in Skyrim, the twisted, feral, cave-dwelling creatures so many adventurers stumble upon in the ruins beneath the mountains. They aren't a separate species entirely removed from the elves. They are the broken, betrayed, remnants of an entire civilization that once rivaled the Aldmer themselves in beauty and devotion, reduced across thousands of years to something almost unrecognizable. Elsewhere on the continent, other transformations were unfolding in parallel. A group of Aldmer who settled in what would become the Cyrodiil region and mingle extensively with early human populations there gave rise, through complicated and still debated lore, to the imperial culture we'll discuss more once humans properly enter this story. And in a much darker corner of Elven history, a faction of Aldmer who followed the Daedric Prince Malakath, or in some tellings were transformed by a curse tied to the Chimer Prince Trinimac's corruption, became the Orsimer, the Orcs, exiled and cursed to live as outsiders across Tamriel, forming their own proud but deeply marginalised warrior culture centred around strongholds and honour codes that persist across every era we'll cover tonight. One more Elven culture deserves mention before we leave the Merethic era behind, because they'll matter enormously once we reach the story of Alessia and the founding of the First Empire. The Aelids, or Wild Elves, settled the fertile region of Cyrodiil long before humans ever arrived there in significant numbers, and they built one of the most architecturally stunning and eventually one of the most infamous civilizations in this entire history. Aeliad society was built around a rigid hierarchy of city-states, each ruled by its own king, and each obsessed with elaborate, beautiful architecture carved from white stone, structures whose crumbling remains still dot the Cyrodiilic countryside thousands of years later, as the Aeliad ruins so many adventurers stumble across. Beneath that beauty, though, Aeliad civilization was built substantially on the backs of enslaved human labour, a practice that, as we're about to see, would eventually provoke the rebellion that reshaped the entire continent's balance of power. By the time the Merethic era finally began drawing to its close, Tamriel was no longer a single unified elven homeland. It was a patchwork of proud, distinct and often deeply suspicious civilizations: Altmer, Bosmer, Chimer, Falmer, Orsimer, each shaped by different philosophies, different gods, and different responses to the same original question of what Lorkhan's sacrifice truly meant. And into this fractured ancient world, a new people were about to arrive from across the northern sea, cold, hardened, and entirely unprepared for the ancient magic and deep-rooted civilizations they were about to encounter. Chapter 5: The Rise and Silence of the Dwemer. Before we follow the humans across the sea from Mount Mora, we need to spend real time with one of the most fascinating and genuinely unsettling civilizations in all of Elder Scrolls lore. The Dwemer, commonly called the Dwarves, despite bearing almost no resemblance to the short, bearded figures that name might conjure in your mind from other fantasy settings. The Dwemer were elves, tall, pale, and deeply intelligent, who settled primarily in the deep cave systems and mountain ranges beneath Morrowind, Skyrim, and later Hammerfell. What set them apart from every other elven culture we've discussed so far wasn't their appearance, but their entire philosophical relationship with magic, religion, and the gods themselves. Where the Altmer clung fiercely to Aedric worship, and the Chimere embraced Daedric spirituality, the Dwemer rejected divine worship almost entirely. they came to view the gods, Aedra and Daedra alike, not as beings deserving reverence, but as forces to be studied, dissected, and eventually surpassed through sheer intellectual and mechanical achievement. This philosophy drove the Dwemer to become the single most technologically and magically advanced civilization Tamriel had ever produced, arguably more advanced than anything that has existed since. They built vast underground cities of brass and steam, intricate clockwork automatons that still function today, millennia after their creators vanished, and developed forms of magical engineering so sophisticated that modern scholars, even the most brilliant wizards of the 3rd and 4th eras, still struggle to fully understand the ruins the Dwemer left behind. If you've ever explored a Dwemer ruin in any of the games, marvelled at the steam-powered constructs, the humming machinery, the strange fusion of magic and technology, you've been walking through the remnants of a civilization that essentially tried to engineer its way past the gods themselves. Dwemer society was organised into a handful of powerful great houses and clans, spread across major underground centres like Blackreach beneath Skyrim and the vast layered city of Bethesda, but also stretching into Morrowind, where their proximity to Chimere territory produced generations of complicated, often mutually beneficial coexistence, trade, and shared scholarship. Dwemer scholars were fascinated by soul magic, and their innovations in that field, capturing and binding souls to power constructs and mechanisms, remain so advanced that even now, in the modern era of the games, soul gems and Dwemer-derived enchanting techniques used by ordinary adventurers still rely on principles first pioneered in those underground workshops thousands of years earlier. It's genuinely one of the more haunting details buried in all of this lore, that so much of the practical magic modern Tamrielic society takes for granted. The enchanting tables, the soul-trapping spells, the intricate clockwork automatons still occasionally found guarding forgotten ruins, all trace back to a civilization that reached, quite literally, past the edge of what mortals were ever meant to touch. That ambition reached its terrifying peak under the leadership of Khagrenak, the greatest Dwemer artificer and priest engineer in their long history. Khagrenak had spent much of his life studying something buried deep beneath Red Mountain in Morrowind, a relic of immeasurable power that we've actually already discussed tonight without naming it directly. The heart of Lorkhan, the divine fragment torn from the broken god at the dawn of creation, had settled beneath that very mountain, pulsing with an energy so immense it was nearly impossible to fully comprehend, let alone control. Khagrenak, ever the ambitious engineer, believed he could harness the heart's power using a set of artifacts he'd spent decades developing, 3 legendary tools known as Keening, Sunder and Wraithguard. His plan was audacious even by Dwemer standards. He intended to use these tools to tap directly into the heart's power and, through it, transform every Dwemer in existence into a new form of god, elevating his entire people beyond mortality itself, using the residual divinity of Lorkhan's sacrifice. The Chimera of Morrowind, led by their own great leader and eventual living god, Nerevar, had formed an uneasy but functional alliance with their Dwemer neighbours for generations by this point. But when word of Khagrenak's plan reached Nerevar and the Chimera Council, alarms spread rapidly. Tampering with the heart of Lorkhan wasn't just dangerous. To the Chimera, and particularly to their spiritual advisors, it represented an act of blasphemy so severe it threatened to unravel the fundamental order of the world itself. Nerevar attempted diplomacy first, negotiating an agreement that the heart would be studied, but never actively used as a power source. But factions within the Dwemer, driven by Khagrenak's obsession, ultimately broke that agreement. What followed was the Battle of Red Mountain, one of the single most consequential conflicts in all of Tamrielic history. Nerevar led the Kema alongside allied Dwemer factions who opposed Kagranak's heresy in a desperate assault against Kagranak's forces at the heart of Red Mountain, determined to stop him before he could complete his ritual. The battle was ferocious, but ultimately Nerevar's forces broke through, and in the chaos something happened that remains even now one of the most debated and mysterious events in the entire setting. The Dwemer vanished, every single one of them. Every Dwemer man, woman and child across every settlement, every city, every corner of their vast underground civilization simply ceased to exist in the same instant. Not killed, not driven away, erased, as though plucked entirely out of the fabric of the world, leaving behind nothing but their empty cities, their still humming machinery, and countless unanswered questions. Kagranak had apparently succeeded in activating his tools and tapping into the heart's power at the exact moment of the battle's climax, and whatever happened in that instant took an entire race with it, an event so strange it's simply come to be known in the lore as the Dwemer's disappearance, or sometimes, more hauntingly, their vanishing. Theories about what actually happened have circulated for literal thousands of in-universe years. Some scholars believe the Dwemer successfully transformed themselves into some higher, incomprehensible state of being, achieving Kagranak's goal of godhood but in a form so alien it's indistinguishable, from the outside, from complete annihilation. Others believe they were scattered across parallel realities or planes of oblivion, still existing somewhere, just permanently severed from Mundus. Whatever truly happened, the Dwemer never returned, and their sudden, total absence left a scar on Tamrielic history nearly as profound as Lorkhan's original sacrifice. Their ruins remain scattered beneath Morrowind and Skyrim to this day, silent monuments to a people who reached too far in their attempt to surpass the very gods who built the world they lived in. Chapter 6: The Tribunal's Ascension. The story of Red Mountain doesn't end with the Dwemer's disappearance, and if you've spent any time with the world of Morrowind specifically, you already know that what happened in the immediate aftermath of that battle shaped an entire province's religion and politics for thousands of years to come. In the confusion and chaos following the Dwemer's sudden vanishing, Nerevar, the great Chimer warlord who had led the assault against Kagranak, was gravely wounded. Accounts differ, as they so often do this deep into Tamrielic mythology, but the most widely accepted version holds that in the aftermath of the battle, 3 of Nerevar's most trusted generals and advisors, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil, made a fateful decision. Rather than destroying the powerful tools Kagranak had used to tap into the heart of Lorkhan, the very tools that had just caused an entire civilization to vanish from existence, the 3 generals took Keening, Sunda and Wraithguard for themselves, and used them, in secret, to tap into the heart's residual divine power. This act granted the 3 of them a form of engineered artificial godhood, transforming Vivek, Almalexia and Sotha Sil into what would become known as the Tribunal, a trio of living gods who would go on to rule over Morrowind and its Dunmer population, formerly the Chimer, for literal thousands of years afterward. Nerevar, according to the most sacred and widely accepted Tribunal Temple doctrine, died from his wounds shortly after the battle, either unaware of his general's betrayal or, in some more skeptical scholarly readings, deliberately killed by them to prevent him from stopping their plan. Before his death, Nerevar is said to have extracted a promise from the Daedric prince Azura, who had grown gravely displeased at the mortal theft and use of Kagranak's tools, that he would one day be reincarnated and return to judge whether the Tribunal's use of that power had been a righteous act of necessity or an unforgivable betrayal of everything he'd fought for. This promise became the foundation of what's remembered as the Nerevaran Prophecy, an ancient and closely guarded set of religious texts foretelling the return of a reincarnated Nerevar, marked by specific prophesied signs, birth signs and trials, who would one day rise up to judge the tribunal and confront whatever threat had by then grown to endanger Morrowind once again. For centuries upon centuries, this prophecy remained largely dormant, occasionally stirring unrest whenever a suspected candidate emerged, only for the heavily entrenched tribunal temple, deeply invested in its own religious authority, to suppress or discredit those claims whenever they arose. It's a prophecy that will matter enormously again much later in tonight's story, right around the very end of the Third Era. But for now, with Vivek Almalexia and Sotha Sil, newly ascended and Nerevar's promise still centuries away from being called due, let's leave Morrowind to its long, uneasy peace under its new living gods and turn our attention to a very different part of Tamriel, where a very different kind of uprising is about to reshape the entire continent. Alright, if you're still with me, we're just about at the halfway point of tonight's story, and I want to take 30 seconds here to say thank you for spending your evening with Nightfall Lore. If this kind of a deep, slow, sleep-friendly lore narration is your thing, consider subscribing so these videos find you automatically when you're winding down for the night. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these longer, more ambitious deep dives like this one. Alright, let's settle back in. We've just watched three mortals seize a fragment of divine power for themselves and become living gods. Now it's time to follow the ancestors of men across the sea into a world already ancient, already scarred and about to change forever. Chapter 7, Alessia and the First Empire. While the Dwemer built their underground kingdoms and the various elven cultures settled across Tamriel, the other branch of the Aelnofae, the ones who had ended up on the frozen continent of Atmora after the ancient sundering, were forging a very different kind of civilization. Life on Atmora was harsh, cold and unforgiving, and it shaped its people into something hardy, martial and deeply resilient. These were the ancestors of what we now call the Nordic race, and eventually, through further migration and mingling, the broader family of human races across Tamriel. At various points across the Merethic era, waves of Atmoran settlers crossed the sea and made landfall in northern Tamriel, in the region that would eventually become Skyrim. The earliest and most famous of these migrations is attributed to a legendary figure named Ysgramor, whose story is foundational to Nordic culture and mythology, even in the modern era of the games. According to legend, Ysgramor and his companions initially settled peacefully alongside the native snow elves, until, as we touched on earlier, a devastating betrayal known as the Night of Tears saw the Falmer slaughter Ysgramor's settlement. Ysgramor fled back to Atmora, gathered an enormous army known as the 500 Companions, and returned to wage a brutal war of vengeance against the Snow Elves, a conflict that, as we discussed, eventually ended with the Falmer's tragic transformation at Dwemer hands. From this point forward, human settlement of Tamriel accelerated dramatically. Nordic tribes spread across Skyrim and beyond, while other waves of migration, less thoroughly documented but equally significant, brought human populations into other regions of the continent, eventually giving rise to the Redguards in Hammerfell, believed to have originated from a now-lost homeland called Yokuda, and the early populations that would settle Cyrodiil and, through extensive mingling with local Aldmer and Nedic peoples, eventually become the Imperial race. It's in Cyrodiil that our story's next major turning point unfolds, and it centres on one of the most important and inspiring figures in the entire history of Tamriel, Alessia. By this point in the timeline, deep into what's now considered the early First Era, the native human populations of Cyrodiil, often referred to as the Needs or ancient Nedic peoples, existed largely as an enslaved underclass beneath the rule of the Aelids, the Wild Elves, an Aldmer-descended culture that had built a sophisticated but deeply oppressive civilization across the region, complete with elaborate cities whose ruins, the Aeliad ruins, still dot the landscape of Cyrodiil in every game set there. Alessia, herself born into this enslaved human population, rose to become the leader of a massive slave rebellion against Aeliad rule, and her uprising succeeded where countless smaller revolts before her had failed. According to the mythologized accounts passed down through imperial religious tradition, Alessia's success wasn't purely a matter of military strategy or charismatic leadership, though she certainly possessed both. It was also a matter of divine intervention. The Aedra themselves, moved by the suffering of the enslaved humans and eager to see a devoted, faithful civilization rise in Cyrodiil, are said to have granted Alessia and her rebellion direct assistance, most famously in the form of Akatosh himself, who according to legend descended and granted Alessia the very first Amulet of Kings, a divine artifact that would go on to play a central role in imperial legitimacy for thousands of years afterward, right up through the Oblivion Crisis we'll cover later tonight. With the Aeliads overthrown and their once grand cities left to crumble into the ruins later generations would explore, Alessia founded the First Empire, sometimes called the Alessian Empire, and along with it she established a new religious and political order that would define Cyrodiilic and eventually broader Tamrielic culture for millennia to come. This included the formal establishment of worship centered around the 8 divines, a pantheon built from the core Aedric gods, adapted and formalized specifically for human worship: Akatosh, Mara, Dibella, Kinnereth, Zenithar, Stendar, Julianos, and Arche. Gods whose shrines and temples you've likely heard mentioned throughout nearly every Elder Scrolls game we've covered on this channel. The Fall of the Aeliad city-states themselves is worth lingering on for a moment, because it wasn't a single clean victory, but a long grinding campaign fought city by city across Cyrodiil. Some Aeliad kings, seeing which way the tide was turning, attempted alliances with Alessia's rebellion, while others fought with desperate, brutal cruelty to hold on to their crumbling authority. The city that would eventually become the imperial city itself, built atop the Aeliad ruin known as the Green Emperor Way and centered on the ancient white gold tower we discussed earlier as one of the great primordial towers of Mundus, was among the last and most fiercely contested Aeliad strongholds to fall. Its capture is remembered in imperial legend as one of the defining moments of Alessia's entire rebellion, the symbolic instant when the enslaved finally became the rulers of the very land that had once bound them. However, Alessia's covenant, the sacred agreement struck between her and the Aedra during the founding of her empire, came with obligations that grew increasingly rigid and extreme in the generations after her death. The religious order she founded eventually calcified into what's remembered as the Alessian Order, or the Alessian Doctrines, a strict theocratic movement that, especially under later rulers, took a dramatically harsher stance than Alessia herself likely ever intended. Under these doctrines, worship of the Daedra was violently suppressed. Harsh persecution was carried out against those who deviated from Alessian orthodoxy, and the Empire's early tolerance curdled into something far more authoritarian. This growing rigidity eventually provoked serious backlash, particularly from a group known as the Direni, an ancient and powerful Aldmer clan who had established significant territorial holdings in the western regions of Tamriel, particularly around what would become the Iliac Bay and the Somerset-adjacent territories. As Alessian doctrine grew more extreme and more militantly anti-Elven in its rhetoric, the Direni increasingly positioned themselves as a counterweight, eventually clashing directly with the Alessian Empire in a series of conflicts that would, centuries later, contribute to the Empire's fragmentation and the beginning of what's remembered as one of the most chaotic and poorly documented stretches in all of Tamrielic history. Chapter 8. The Interregnum and the Wars of Righteousness. The First Empire, founded by Alessia, did not last forever, and its slow unravelling stretched across the later centuries of the First Era, eventually giving way to a period so fractured, so poorly recorded, and so thoroughly chaotic that historians within the setting itself often simply throw up their hands and refer to large chunks of it as the Interregnum, a word that essentially just means the gap between reigns. As Alessian doctrine grew increasingly extreme, particularly under the rule of later Alessian monarchs, who pushed anti-Daedric persecution and religious authoritarianism to new extremes, resentment simmered not just among the Elven populations still resisting imperial expansion, but even among the human subjects of the Empire itself. Eventually, this resentment erupted into what's remembered as the Rebellion, led by figures pushing back against the harshest doctrines, weakening Alessian central authority and opening the door for other powers to reassert themselves. Chief among these resurgent powers were the Direni, who by this point had consolidated significant strength in the western reaches of Tamriel. In a conflict remembered as the Alessian-Direni Wars, or sometimes grouped under the broader banner of the Wars of Righteousness, the Direni pushed back hard against Alessian expansion, eventually inflicting a series of defeats significant enough to permanently curb Alessian ambitions and carve out what would become the long-lasting Direni hegemony, an Elven-dominated political structure that controlled large portions of the Iliac Bay region for centuries afterward. It's worth noting, if you're the kind of listener who likes trivia to hold on to as you drift towards sleep, that the Direni hegemony's territory and legacy directly shape the geography and politics you'd later encounter if you were ever to explore the world of the Daggerfall region in earlier Elder Scrolls games. As Elysian central authority crumbled and fractured further, the political map of Tamriel entered one of its most genuinely chaotic stretches. Small kingdoms rose and fell rapidly. Regional powers shifted allegiances constantly. Entire cultures rose to prominence and collapsed again within the span of a few centuries. A blink of an eye by the standards of a setting where elves can live for many hundreds of years. This is also, notably, the era during which many of the individual racial and cultural identities we recognise from the games began solidifying into their more familiar distinct political structures. The Bosmer formalised much of their Volanwood governance during this stretch. The Khajiit of elsewhere developed increasingly complex trade-based city-states, and the Red Guards of Hammerfell, having fled the destruction of their ancestral Yokudan homeland generations earlier, established the powerful and fiercely independent kingdoms that would define Hammerfell's proud warrior culture for the rest of Tamrielic history. Perhaps the most historically pivotal development to emerge from this chaotic stretch of the First and early Second Era, though, was the founding and eventual acquisition of the powerful magical artifact known as Numidium, an event that requires us to circle back briefly to the descendants of those vanished Dwemer. Though the Dwemer themselves were gone, their technology and ruins remained scattered across Tamriel, and various factions throughout this era spent generations attempting to unlock and understand the secrets left behind. The most significant of these efforts culminated in the eventual construction, deep in the ruins of Dwemer territory, of a colossal animated construct known as Numidium, the Brass God, a weapon of almost unimaginable power built using recovered Dwemer engineering and, crucially, a soul gem powerful enough to serve as its animating heart. Numidium's early history is murky and disputed even within the lore itself, but what's clear is that its existence and eventual activation would go on to play an absolutely pivotal role in the unification of Tamriel under a single empire for the first time since Alessia's original covenant, centuries earlier, and the figure who would eventually seize control of that terrifying weapon and use it to reshape the entire continent's political landscape is one of the most consequential individuals in this entire story. It's time, finally, deep into the Second Era, to talk about Tiber Septim. Chapter 9: Tiber Septim and the Third Empire. Few figures in Elder Scrolls lore generate as much genuine mythological weight as Tiber Septim, later known and worshipped as Talos, the Ninth Divine, whose ascension to godhood remains one of the most politically charged and religiously significant events in the entire setting. One whose ripple effects you can still feel echoing right up through the events of Skyrim, thousands of years later. Tiber Septim was born, according to the most widely accepted accounts, in Cyrodiil under the name Tiber Septim, though some traditions claim he originated in Atmora or elsewhere before rising to prominence within Cyrodiilic politics and military campaigns. What's undisputed, regardless of which version of his murky early biography you subscribe to, is that Tiber Septim proved to be an extraordinarily gifted military commander and political strategist, one who began consolidating power across the fractured, war-torn landscape of late Second Era Tamriel with startling speed and effectiveness. Through a combination of brilliant military campaigns, shrewd political alliances, and, crucially, eventual access to and control over the Numidium construct we just discussed, Tiber Septim accomplished something no ruler had managed since Alessia's original empire many centuries earlier. He unified the entirety of Tamriel, or something remarkably close to it, under a single centralized authority, conquering or absorbing the various elven kingdoms, human city-states, and regional powers scattered across the continent, forging what would become known as the Third Empire, or more commonly the Septim Empire, the political structure that forms the backdrop for the entire Third Era, including the events of Morrowind and Oblivion for those of you familiar with those games specifically. The activation of Numidium during Tiber Septim's campaigns is itself a hugely significant, if somewhat contested, event in the lore. Various accounts describe the brass god being unleashed against remaining pockets of resistance, particularly against the Dureni hegemony we discussed a moment ago, whose long-standing western territories finally fell under Septim's expanding authority, thanks in large part to Numidium's overwhelming world-shaking power. The construct was said to be so immense and so magically potent that its activation alone was enough to end wars before they properly began, forcing surrender through sheer, undeniable demonstration of force. Tiber Septim's campaigns didn't stop at the borders of Cyrodiil or even at the former Dureni territories in the west. His armies pushed into Hammerfell as well, where the proud, battle-hardened Redguard kingdoms, descendants of the Yokudan refugees who'd fled the destruction of their homeland generations earlier, put up some of the fiercest resistance encountered anywhere during his entire conquest. The eventual arrangement struck between Tiber Septim and the Redguard leadership, mediated in part by a mysterious, immensely long-lived Redguard figure known as the Under-King, resulted in Hammerfell joining the Empire on terms far more favourable and autonomous than most other conquered territories were ever granted, a testament to just how costly and difficult that particular campaign had proven. The Under-King's own story is one of the stranger footnotes in this entire history, a Redguard warrior king said to have extended his own life through ancient Yokudan sword magic for centuries in order to see his people safely settled before finally and permanently allowing himself to die once he judged that duty complete. But perhaps the single most mythologically important moment in Tiber Septim's entire story isn't a battle or a conquest at all. It's his death, and more specifically, what happened after it. According to the deeply revered and notably heavily disputed imperial religious tradition, Tiber Septim did not simply die as a mortal man the way every ruler before him eventually had. Instead, through a combination of his own extraordinary deeds, his connection to the ancient hero god Ysmir associated with the Nordic tradition, and quite possibly some manner of intervention or fusion involving Akatosh, and the very concept of time and dragon blood itself, Tiber Septim ascended beyond mortality entirely, becoming a genuine god in his own right. He became Talos, worshipped from that point forward as the 9th member of the divine pantheon, joining Akatosh, Mara, Dibella, Kinnereth, Zenithar, Stendar, Julianos and Arkay as a figure of formal religious devotion across the empire. This apotheosis, though, wasn't universally accepted or celebrated, and that disagreement over Talos's true divine legitimacy becomes one of the most consequential and explosive political fault lines in the entirety of later Tamrielic history. The Aldmer in particular, deeply invested in their own theological traditions and their long-standing belief in elven spiritual superiority, categorically reject Talos's godhood, viewing his worship as, at best, a kind of blasphemous human overreach, and at worst, a genuine metaphysical threat, tied to unsettling theories that Talos's ascension somehow disrupted or damaged the fundamental structure of time itself. This theological dispute, seemingly abstract and academic on the surface, eventually becomes one of the direct sparks for one of the most devastating wars in Tamrielic history, the Great War, which we'll get to a bit later tonight. For now, though, under Tiber Septim's rule, and that of his immediate successors, the Third Empire ushered in an extended period of relative stability and prosperity across Tamriel, one that would persist, with plenty of political turbulence along the way for hundreds of years, right up until a moment of sudden catastrophic crisis that struck at the very end of the Third Era, when the Empire's own royal bloodline and the ancient protective barrier they'd maintained for centuries was violently and unexpectedly shattered. Chapter 10. The Oblivion Crisis. If you've spent any time at all in the Elder Scrolls community, you've almost certainly heard the phrase, "The gates of Oblivion have opened," and tonight we finally get to properly tell that story, one of the most dramatic and consequential single events covered across the entire game series. By the close of the Third Era, the Septim Empire, now hundreds of years removed from Tiber Septim's original conquests, was ruled by Emperor Uriel Septim VII, the latest in a long dynastic line stretching all the way back to Talos himself. Central to the legitimacy and, crucially, the physical safety of the entire empire was an ancient artifact we briefly mentioned earlier, the Amulet of Kings, said to have been granted to Alessia by Akatosh himself, and passed down through the Septim bloodline as both a symbol of divine right to rule and, far more importantly in practical terms, as the literal magical seal maintaining the dragonfires, an eternal flame housed within the Imperial City's Temple of the One that kept the barriers between Mundus and the Plane of Oblivion firmly shut. This barrier was not merely symbolic. It was quite literally the only thing standing between Tamriel and Mehrunes Dagon, the fearsome Daedric Prince of Destruction, Change and Ambition, who had coveted dominion over the mortal realm for millennia. When a secretive fanatical cult known as the Mythic Dawn, secretly serving Mehrunes Dagon and operating with disturbing reach into the highest levels of imperial government, orchestrated the assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, and critically every one of his legitimate heirs in a single devastating strike, the seal maintaining the dragonfires was left without anyone of the true royal bloodline to maintain it. With the Septim bloodline seemingly extinguished, and the Amulet of Kings stolen by the assassins, the ancient barrier began to fail catastrophically. Gates to Oblivion tore open across the entirety of Cyrodiil, and beyond it, the wider empire, unleashing hordes of Daedric creatures onto the mortal world. Entire towns and settlements were destroyed. Terrified refugees fled in every direction. It seemed, for a genuinely terrifying stretch, that Mehrunes Dagon's long-sought invasion of Mundus was finally unstoppably underway, an apocalyptic event that would come to be remembered simply as the Oblivion Crisis. It's worth spending a moment on the Mythic Dawn itself, since their motivations tie directly back into the darker philosophical undercurrent we touched on earlier tonight, the belief held by certain fringe schools of thought that Mundus represents an unfinished mistake rather than a gift, and that the truest path forward lies in unmaking it entirely. The Mythic Dawn's leader, a charismatic and deeply dangerous cultist named Mankar Cameron, preached a version of this philosophy explicitly centred on Mehrunes Dagon, framing the Prince of Destruction not as a villain, but as a liberator, one who would tear down a broken, corrupted Mundus and remake it fresh, unburdened by the compromises and diminishments the Aedra had accepted at the dawn of creation. Cameron's own personal writings, compiled into a text called the Mythic Dawn Commentaries, remain one of the more unsettling pieces of in-universe literature precisely because they reframe Lorkhan's original sacrifice not as heroism, but as a kind of original sin, one the Mythic Dawn believed only Dagon's intervention could ever truly cleanse. Salvation, as it so often does in this story, came from an unlikely and initially unassuming source. A young priest named Martin serving quietly in the small town of Kvatch, when the Oblivion Crisis first struck, was revealed, in one of the more emotionally resonant twists in the entire series, to be an illegitimate but genuine bloodline heir of Uriel Septim VII, the last living descendant capable of relighting the dragon fires and sealing the breach in reality. Guided and protected by a Blades agent, the loyal knightly order sworn to protect the Emperor, Martin was gradually drawn into a desperate campaign to close the gates, recover the stolen Amulet of Kings, and confront the Mythic Dawn before Mehrunes Dagon could fully manifest his physical avatar within Mundus. The climax of this crisis unfolds at the Battle of the Imperial City, where Mehrunes Dagon, having finally gathered enough strength and momentum through the chaos of the ongoing invasion, tore open a massive gate, directly at the heart of the Imperial City itself, and began manifesting his colossal, world-shaking avatar in an attempt to claim dominion over Tamriel directly. Martin, cornered and facing an entity of genuinely godlike destructive power, made the same kind of world-altering sacrifice that echoes quietly all the way back to Lorkhan's original choice at the dawn of creation. Rather than attempting to fight Dagon directly, Martin used the Amulet of Kings itself, along with his own divine bloodline connection to Akatosh, to transform himself into a massive dragon-like avatar of Akatosh, engaging Mehrunes Dagon's avatar in a cataclysmic battle that shook the very foundations of the Imperial City. Martin's transformation succeeded in driving Dagon's avatar back through the gate and sealing it permanently, but the sacrifice was total and final. Martin himself, and the Amulet of Kings along with him, was consumed entirely in the process, extinguishing the dragon fires forever, and with them the formal end of the Septim dynastic line and the specific divine protection it had provided for centuries. The Oblivion Crisis was over. Tamriel was saved, but the empire that emerged from the ashes of that victory was a fundamentally different, more fragile institution than the one that had entered the crisis, setting the stage, across the following decades, for the slow imperial decline and dramatic geopolitical shifts that would come to define the Fourth Era. Chapter 11. The Nerevarine and the Fall of Dagothur. Let's circle back now to a promise made thousands of years earlier, back when we first met Nerevar, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sotha Sil in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Red Mountain. You'll remember that before his death, Nerevar extracted a vow from the Daedric Prince Azura that he would one day return, reincarnated to judge the tribunal for their theft of Khagranak's tools. For centuries upon centuries, that promise remained just that. A promise, a quiet, dormant prophecy occasionally stirred up and just as quickly suppressed by a tribunal temple, with every incentive to keep its living gods safely unquestioned. But roughly at the very end of the Third Era, in the same general stretch of years overlapping the Oblivion Crisis we just finished covering, that centuries-old tension finally broke wide open. A mysterious and increasingly dangerous threat had begun stirring beneath Red Mountain itself. Dagoth, once one of Nerevar's own most loyal companions and like the Tribunal, someone who had gained access to the heart of Lorkhan's residual power in the confused aftermath of the original battle, had spent the intervening centuries sealed away beneath the mountain, slowly gathering strength, corrupting the local Dwemer populace through a strange psychic and physical affliction known as the Blight, and steadily building toward an attempt to seize the heart's power entirely for himself and turn all of Morrowind into an extension of his own will. It fell, ultimately, to a prisoner transported to Morrowind under mysterious imperial orders, an individual who would go on to be recognised as the true incarnation of Nerevar himself, the Nerevarine, to fulfill the ancient prophecy, confront Dagoth beneath Red Mountain, and permanently sever his connection to the heart of Lorkhan's power, ending the Blight and the immediate threat once and for all. The confrontation also inevitably forced a reckoning with the Tribunal themselves, whose long-guarded secret regarding Nerevar's death and their theft of Khagranak's tools was finally, after thousands of years, dragged fully into the light. Depending on the path taken by the Nerevarine in that final confrontation, the Tribunal's own remaining claim to godhood, itself entirely dependent on continued access to the heart's power, could be preserved, diminished, or severed entirely, a resolution with consequences that wouldn't stay contained to Morrowind for very long at all. It's a strange, quietly tragic little coda to the story of Red Mountain, isn't it? A weapon built to make an entire race into gods instead erased them from existence, and the very tools they left behind ended up making a handful of mortals into gods themselves. Gods who then spent thousands of years ruling over a province built, quite literally, on top of the buried heart of the being who started this entire cosmic chain of sacrifice in the first place, only for that same buried heart to eventually call one final, prophesied reckoning down upon them, and with the Tribunal's power broken or badly diminished, with the ancient god engine beneath Red Mountain finally, truly severed from mortal hands, the mountain itself was no longer being held quite as firmly in check as it once had been. Chapter 12, The Red Year and the Fall of the Tribunal. Before we follow the Empire into the Great War, we need to circle back one more time to Morrowind, because in the years immediately following the Oblivion Crisis, the province and its people endured a catastrophe every bit as world-altering as anything Mehrunes Dagon managed to unleash on Cyrodiil, and it's a story that directly shapes the political map of the Fourth Era we're about to enter. As we discussed earlier, the Nerevarines' confrontation with Dagoth beneath Red Mountain severed the Tribunal's connection to the heart of Lorkhan, stripping Vivec, Almalexia and Sotha Sil of the artificial godhood they'd maintained for thousands of years. This alone would have been a seismic shock to Dwemer society, whose entire religious, political and cultural structure had been built for millennia around the living presence of their tribunal gods. But the true catastrophe struck shortly afterward, in the year that would come to be remembered simply as the Red Year. Vivec, the last of the tribunal still maintaining any real power by this point, had for centuries used the remnants of his divine authority to hold back the volcanic fury of Red Mountain itself, keeping the mountain's immense destructive potential suppressed through sheer force of will. When that power finally failed, whether through the Nerevarine actions, the machinations of Vivek's enemies, or simply the natural consequence of a weakened god no longer able to hold back a mountain's worth of pent-up devastation, Red Mountain erupted with a violence that reshaped the entire province in a single horrific event. Ash storms swept across Vardenfell and the Morrowind mainland, burying cities, poisoning farmland, and killing an almost unthinkable percentage of the Dunmer population in a matter of days. The city of Vivek itself, once among the largest and most magnificent urban centres in all of Tamriel, was left in ruins. Entire noble houses, entire generations of Dunmer culture and history were wiped out or scattered as refugees fleeing a homeland that had, quite suddenly, become nearly uninhabitable. Adding to the catastrophe, the weakened, leaderless state of post-Red Year Morrowind proved an irresistible opportunity for the Argonians of Black Marsh, whose ancient historical grievances against Dunmer slavers stretched back centuries, given that Dunmer noble houses had long maintained a brutal, extensive slave trade drawing heavily on captured Argonian labour. In what's remembered as the Argonian invasion, forces from Black Marsh swept into the weakened, ash-choked province, seizing territory and, in a final, symbolically devastating act, sacking and burning the city of Mournhold itself, one of the last remaining seats of Dunmer political power. The invasion permanently ended what remained of organised Dunmer slavery and left Morrowind, already reeling from the Red Year's devastation, in an even more fractured and diminished state heading into the Fourth Era. Out of this wreckage, the surviving Dunmer populations scattered across Tamriel as refugees, with significant populations resettling in northern Morrowind around the city of Windhelm and Skyrim, and elsewhere across the Empire, carrying their culture, their grief, and their considerable resentment with them into new homelands that didn't always welcome them warmly. This diaspora is part of why, by the time we reach the events of Skyrim itself, you'll find sizable, often marginalised Dunmer communities living in places like the Grey Quarter of Windhelm, a people still carrying the scars of a catastrophe that, in the grand scheme of this entire cosmology, traces its roots all the way back to Kagranak's original theft of divine power beneath Red Mountain, so many thousands of years earlier. It's a sobering reminder, this deep into our story, of just how long the consequences of a single act of hubris can echo forward through history, rippling outward across entire civilizations long after the individuals responsible are gone. Chapter 13. The Great War and the Fourth Era. In the decades following the Oblivion Crisis and the extinguishing of the Dragonfires, the Septim Empire, now without its founding bloodline and the specific divine legitimacy that bloodline had provided for hundreds of years, entered a long, slow period of political instability. The Fourth Era, the most recent era covered across the mainline games most of you have probably actually played, opens with an empire still nominally powerful, but increasingly fragile beneath the surface, its authority propped up more by inertia and remaining military strength than by the kind of divine mandate Alessia and Tiber Septim had once commanded. Into this weakened political landscape stepped the Aldmer Dominion, a reconstituted and increasingly aggressive political and military alliance dominated by the Aldmer of Somerset and the Bosmer of Valenwood, led by a shadowy, deeply ideological faction known as the Thalmor. The Thalmor represented a resurgence of the oldest, most persistent thread running through this entire story. The Aldmer belief in elven cultural and spiritual superiority, now weaponized into an explicit long-term political, and many scholars within the setting believe genuinely metaphysical goal: the eventual unmaking of Mundus itself, undoing Lorkhan's original act of creation and restoring the Aedra to their full, undiminished divinity. Whether or not every individual Thalmor agent is consciously working toward that ultimate cosmic goal, the immediate practical face of Thalmor policy centres heavily on the aggressive suppression of Talos worship, viewing Tiber Septim's disputed apotheosis as both religious blasphemy and, in their eyes, a literal wound in the fabric of time itself. This theological and political tension eventually erupted into full-scale war when the resurgent Aldmeri Dominion launched a devastating military campaign against the weakened Septim Empire, a conflict remembered simply as the Great War. The Great War proved catastrophic for Imperial forces, with Dominion armies pushing deep into Imperial territory at one especially devastating and symbolically crushing point, even occupying portions of the Imperial city itself, the seat of Imperial power dating all the way back to Tiber Septim's original conquests. Facing the very real possibility of total unconditional defeat, the Empire, then led by Emperor Titus Mede II, was ultimately forced into an extraordinarily humiliating peace settlement known as the White Gold Concordat, a treaty that formally ended the Great War but at an enormous political and religious cost. Among the treaty's most consequential and controversial provisions was the formal empire-wide banning of Talos worship, a stunning capitulation given that Talos had been formally recognised as the ninth divine and a central figure of imperial religious identity for literally centuries at that point. This provision alone generates enormous internal resentment and political instability across the Empire in the years that follow, providing much of the ideological fuel for the Stormcloak Rebellion that erupts in Skyrim, the civil war that forms the immediate political backdrop for the events of the most recent mainline game in the series. It's worth pausing here to properly introduce Ulfric Stormcloak himself, since his story is so tightly bound to the consequences of this treaty. Ulfric was present as a young soldier during the darkest moments of the Great War, including the fall of the Imperial city, and was later captured and subjected to Thalmor interrogation and torture, an experience that hardened him permanently against both the Dominion and, by extension, an imperial government he came to see as too willing to bend the knee to Elven demands rather than continue fighting for Talos, for Skyrim's independence, and for Nordic pride more broadly. By the time we reach the events most of you actually played through in the games, Ulfric's grievance has calcified into open rebellion, framed explicitly around the banned worship of Talos but carrying underneath it centuries of accumulated Nordic resentment toward Imperial and Elven authority alike. Resentment that, as we've now traced across this entire story, stretches all the way back to the earliest Atmaran landings and the ancient wars against the Falmer. The White Gold Concordat also granted the Thalmor sweeping rights to operate Justicia agents within Imperial territory, hunting down and punishing continued Talos worship wherever it persisted, a deeply invasive provision that transforms daily life for ordinary citizens across the Empire, and sows the seeds of resentment, rebellion, and deep cultural fracture that ripple outward across the entirety of the Fourth Era. The once mighty Septim Empire, having lost its founding divine bloodline in the Oblivion Crisis, and now humiliated and weakened by the Great War, enters a long, uncertain decline, its authority genuinely contested for the first time since Tiber Septim's original unification, all while an ancient threat, one far older than the Empire itself, one older even than most of the Elven and human civilizations we've discussed tonight, begins quietly stirring in the frozen north. Chapter 14: Alduin and the Last Dragonborn. We've arrived finally at the most recent chapter of this enormous story, the events that most of you likely know best from personal experience, having walked these snow-covered roads yourselves. Skyrim, in the years following the Great War, is a province teetering on the edge of collapse, torn between loyalist imperial forces attempting to maintain the increasingly unpopular White Gold Concordat and the Stormcloak Rebellion, led by Ulfric Stormcloak, a proud Nord warrior fighting explicitly against the ban on Talos worship, and more broadly, against what many Nords perceive as growing imperial subservience to Thalmor demands. It's into this already volatile civil war that the true central crisis of this final chapter emerges. Alduin, the eldest son of Akatosh himself in Nordic mythology, a being of terrifying world-ending power known across ancient legend as the World Eater, returns from a self-imposed exile across time itself. According to the oldest Nordic prophecies, ones that stretch all the way back to the earliest days of human settlement in Skyrim, Alduin was originally defeated in a distant, nearly forgotten age by a trio of ancient Nord heroes using a devastating technique known as the Dragon Rend, a shout that, uniquely among all forms of dragon magic, forces even a godlike dragon like Alduin down into a state of vulnerable, grounded mortality. Rather than being killed outright, Alduin was instead hurled forward through time itself, and the events of Skyrim mark the moment of his long-delayed, prophesied return. Alduin's reappearance coincides, seemingly not by accident, with the emergence of the story's central hero, a figure known as the Dragonborn, a mortal born with the soul of a dragon, a rare and legendary gift tracing all the way back to Akatosh's own blessing upon the Septim bloodline centuries earlier, though by this point in history, the gift can manifest unpredictably in individuals well outside any formal royal lineage. This Dragonborn hero, our protagonist across the entire Skyrim narrative, discovers early on that they possess Thu'um, the ancient and immensely powerful voice used by dragons, and, through a ritual older than recorded Tamrielic history, by an ancient order of monks known as the Greybeards, dwelling in seclusion high atop the throat of the world, itself one of the great primordial towers we discussed back near the beginning of tonight's story. As dragons, believed extinct or at least dormant for centuries, begin reappearing across Skyrim, sowing terror and devastation in Alduin's wake, the Dragonborn is drawn into an escalating conflict that ultimately transcends the political civil war unfolding around them. While Stormcloaks and Imperial Loyalists continue their bloody struggle for control of Skyrim's throne, an entirely separate and far more existentially significant war is quietly building in the background, one that threatens not just Skyrim, not just the Empire, but potentially all of Mundus itself, should Alduin succeed in his ancient prophesied goal of literally devouring the world, unmaking creation, and returning everything to the same kind of primordial nothingness that existed before Anu and Padomay first collided at the very beginning of this entire story. The Dragonborn's journey across Skyrim brings them into contact with the Greybeards, who train them further in the use of the Thu'um and eventually leads them into the realm of Sovngarde itself, the Nordic afterlife, where the spirits of legendary heroes from across Tamrielic history continue to dwell. It's within Sovngarde, alongside the spirits of the very heroes who first defeated Alduin using Dragonrend so many ages earlier, that the Dragonborn finally confronts Alduin directly in a climactic world-defining battle. Using the combined power of Dragonrend to ground the World Eater and drawing on the full mastery of the Thu'um developed across their journey, the Dragonborn ultimately defeats Alduin, banishing the ancient threat and in doing so ending the prophesied cycle of destruction that had loomed over Nordic legend since the very earliest days of human settlement in Skyrim. Alongside the battle against Alduin, the Dragonborn's journey across Skyrim brings them face to face with the lingering remnants of an ancient, long-vanished human civilization known as the Dragon Cult, a society of early Nordic priests who, in the deep pre-Ysgramor stretches of Skyrim's history, actually worshipped dragons as living gods rather than fighting them as enemies. The most powerful of these priests, preserved across the ages through dark, dragon-granted rituals, are encountered as undead dragon priests scattered throughout ancient barrows and temples across Skyrim's mountains, guardians of powerful artifacts and forgotten Thu'um knowledge that the Dragonborn draws on throughout their journey. This ancient conflict between the dragon cult and the earliest Free Nords, the ones who eventually rejected dragon worship and rose up against their draconic rulers, forms its own quiet echo of the same pattern we've traced all night, an oppressed people rising against beings who considered themselves untouchable rulers by divine right, not unlike Alessia's rebellion against the Aelids so many thousands of years earlier. The civil war between the Stormcloaks and the Empire, meanwhile, continues to unfold in the background of the Dragonborn's larger struggle against Alduin, and its ultimate resolution, whichever side a given Dragonborn chooses to support, doesn't erase the deeper tensions we've traced across this entire final stretch of the story. Whether Skyrim remains within a weakened empire or breaks way entirely under Stormcloak independence, the underlying wound left by the Great War, the banned worship of a god born from a mortal man, the resentment simmering between Nord and Elf, and the slow, uncertain decline of an empire that once stretched across the entire continent all remain very much unresolved by the time Alduin himself is finally cast down, a reminder that even the largest, most world-ending mythological threats rarely settle the smaller, more human conflicts still burning underneath them. So, thousands upon thousands of years after Anu and Padomay first collided, after Lorkhan sacrificed his own heart to breathe life into an unfinished world, after empires rose and elven civilizations splintered, and an entire race of Dwemer vanished beneath a mountain, we arrive at this quiet, snow-covered moment high in the mountains of Skyrim, with a single mortal hero standing where gods and heroes have stood before them, having carried forward, whether they ever fully understood it or not, the same ancient thread of sacrifice that has run through every chapter of this cosmology so far. That brings our chronological journey through Tamriel's major eras to a close, but there are still a couple of threads left hanging before we can call tonight's story complete, so let's spend a little more time together before we finally settle in for the night. Chapter 15. The Beast Races. Khajiit and Argonians. I want to slow down for a moment and give proper attention to two cultures we've mostly skipped past so far. Not because they are any less important to this history, but because their origins run along a slightly different track than the elfin man lineages we've been following all night, which is why it made more sense to set them apart and cover them here, rather than breaking up the main chronological thread earlier. I'm talking about the Khajiit of Elsewhere and the Argonians of Black Marsh, two of the so-called beast races of Tamriel, and both of them have creation stories every bit as strange and cosmically significant as anything we've covered so far tonight. Let's start in Elsewhere, the warm, sandy province bordering Valenwood and Cyrodiil to the southeast, home to the Khajiit. Khajiit mythology holds that their people are descended not from the El Nofi lineage that produced the elves and men, but from Alkosh, an ancient and revered lunar deity, alongside a complicated pantheon that intersects, in genuinely fascinating ways, with the broader Edric and Daedric cosmology we've spent all night exploring. Central to Khajiit religious belief is the idea that their people were shaped, quite literally, by the phase of Tamriel's two moons, Massa and Secunda, at the moment of their birth, a belief that explains one of the most visually striking and narratively rich elements of Khajiit culture found across every game they appear in, the astonishing physical diversity within their own race. Unlike most other races in Tamriel, who maintain a fairly consistent physical form from individual to individual, Khajiit can be born in dramatically different physical shapes, ranging from small, fully feline forms barely capable of speech, all the way up through more humanoid bipedal forms closely resembling what most players actually encounter as playable Khajiit characters in the more recent games. According to Khajiit belief, this variation isn't random, It's a direct reflection of where the moons sat in the sky at the exact moment of each individual's birth, meaning that every single Khajiit walking through elsewhere, or wandering the roads of Skyrim as a travelling merchant, carries within their very body a permanent physical record of a specific celestial alignment, a concept that ties their entire race directly and inseparably into the same cosmic astronomical forces that shaped the creation of Mundus itself, all those countless ages ago. Khajiit mythology also intersects with the broader Aldmeri creation story in interesting ways, with some traditions holding that the Khajiit and the Aldmer share a distant common ancestor, both descending from beings touched by the same primordial forces at the dawn of Mundus, but diverging along entirely separate paths shaped by different gods, different lands, and different cosmic influences. Whatever the precise mechanism, by the time recorded history properly begins, the Khajiit have already built a distinct, proud civilization across elsewhere, one built heavily around trade, caravans, and a cultural fluidity that allows them to move between more feral animalistic lifestyles and more urbane, mercantile ones, depending entirely on the individual and the moon phase that shaped them. Now, let's travel southwest, into the humid, swamp-choked province of Black Marsh, home to the Argonians, and here the creation story takes an even stranger and, honestly, an even more beautiful turn. Argonian mythology and biology are inseparably tied to a single, massive, ancient entity known as the Hist, a network of sentient, telepathically linked trees found scattered throughout the swamps of Black Marsh. According to Argonian belief, and honestly, according to a fair amount of observable in-universe biology confirmed across multiple games, the Hist aren't just sacred to the Argonian people, they're understood to be the literal origin point of the Argonian race itself, ancient beings who, in some tellings, predate even Mundus's creation and exist partially outside the normal flow of mortal time entirely. The Hist communicate with individual Argonians through a specially brewed sap, granting visions, guidance, and in certain extreme circumstances, the ability to physically transform an individual Argonian's body in response to environmental threats or societal needs, a biological adaptability found in no other race across Tamriel. This deep, almost symbiotic connection to the Hist also shapes one of the more unique aspects of Argonian society and history, their historical resistance to outside conquest. Black Marsh's dense, disease-ridden swamps, combined with the sheer alien unfamiliarity of dealing with a population capable of Hist-granted physical adaptation, made the province notoriously difficult for outside empires to conquer and hold, and Black Marsh maintains, across nearly every era we've discussed tonight, a level of independence and cultural continuity that few other Tamrielic provinces can claim, even during the height of Septim Imperial expansion. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of this resilience comes during a period known as the Kanahatan Flu, a devastating plague that swept across Black Marsh sometime during the Second Era, killing outsiders and non-native Argonian populations with horrifying efficiency, while leaving the native Argonian population almost entirely unaffected. Rather than treating this as a tragedy, later Argonian oral tradition, and, disturbingly, some historical accounts, suggest that certain factions within Argonian society may have deliberately encouraged or even engineered the plague's spread as a means of permanently expelling foreign occupiers and colonizers from their homeland. A chilling but undeniably effective act of biological resistance that reshaped the demographics and political independence of Black Marsh for centuries to follow. Both the Khajiit and the Argonians, in their own dramatically different ways, remind us of something worth sitting with as we head toward the final stretch of tonight's story. Not every culture in Tamriel traces its lineage back through the Aldmer, through Lorkhan's heart, or through the long chain of elven and human migration we've spent most of tonight following. Some peoples grew from entirely separate cosmic roots, shaped by moons and ancient sentient trees, rather than broken gods and fleeing spirits, and yet they still found themselves woven into the exact same shared world, subject to the exact same empires, wars and prophecies as everyone else. It's one of the quiet, persistent truths of this entire setting. However different the origin, everyone eventually ends up walking the same battered ancient ground together. Chapter 16, The Daedric Princes, now, to properly close out tonight's journey. I want to spend a little time on a piece of this cosmology we've mentioned again and again throughout the story, but never fully unpacked on its own. The Daedric Princes. The powerful ancient spirits who chose not to sacrifice themselves in the creation of Mundus, and who instead rule as near-omnipotent lords over their own individual realms of oblivion, each one a reflection of their personal philosophy, obsession, or domain. There are 17 commonly recognised Daedric princes across the lore, though the exact number is debated even within the setting itself, and each one governs a distinct sphere of influence, along with their own personally shaped plane of oblivion, often called their realm. Mehrunes Dagon, whom we already spent considerable time with during the Oblivion Crisis, rules over destruction, revolution and violent change. His realm the ash-choked volcanic Deadlands. Molag Bal, one of the most reviled princes in the entire pantheon, governs domination, enslavement, and corruption, infamous in the lore as the entity responsible for the very first vampire, having forcibly cursed a mortal woman in an act that established an entire bloodline of undead creatures that persists across every era of Tamrielic history. Sheogorath, the Prince of Madness, occupies a strange, beloved space in the fandom precisely because of his deeply unpredictable, often darkly comedic nature, ruling over his realm of the Shivering Isles with a chaotic, ever-shifting sense of logic that somehow, beneath the madness, often reveals surprisingly sharp insight into the nature of sanity and perception itself. Azura, Prince of Dusk and Dawn, stands in stark contrast to many of her Daedric peers, widely regarded as one of the more benevolent princes, deeply revered by the Chimere and later Dwemer as a guiding protective figure, and central to the tragic prophecy surrounding Nerevar's eventual return, a thread that runs deep through the Morrowind era of this larger story. Boethia, Prince of Deceit, Treachery and the overthrow of the rightful order, holds particular cultural significance to the Dwemer, credited in their mythology with corrupting and ultimately transforming the once loyal Aldmeri champion Trinimac into the twisted deity Malakath, an act that, depending on the telling, directly ties back to the origin of the Orsimer we discussed earlier in tonight's story. Hermaeus Mora, Prince of Forbidden Knowledge and Fate, governs a realm called the Apocrypha, an endless, shifting library of books and tentacled shadows, forever collecting knowledge from every corner of existence, at a cost that inevitably proves far steeper than it first appears to those tempted to seek his wisdom. Meridia governs light and the energy of living things, standing in fierce opposition to the undead and necromantic practices favoured by other princes. Namira governs darkness, decay, and the revulsion mortals feel toward death and the grotesque. Vermina haunts the realm of nightmares and twisted dreams, feeding on the fear and torment she inflicts on sleeping mortal minds, which, if you're drifting off right now, is perhaps not the most comforting thought to end on, though I promise you're in no danger tonight. Malakath, as mentioned, watches over the spurned, the outcast, and the Orsimer specifically, offering them strength and community in the face of the exile, and prejudice they've endured across nearly every era of this story. Peryite governs pestilence, and the lowest, most menial tasks among the princes, often regarded as one of the weaker figures in the Daedric hierarchy. Clavicus Vile governs wishes, power, and the treacherous bargains so often required to obtain them, forever accompanied by his loyal, unsettling hound Barbas. Nocturnal governs the shadows, luck, and the fortunes of thieves and those who move unseen through the world. Hircine governs the Great Hunt, granting lycanthropy to mortals who prove themselves worthy prey or worthy hunters within his eternal chase. Mephala governs secrets, sex, and murder, another figure deeply entwined in the earliest Chimere mythology alongside Boethia and Azura. And Sanguine governs hedonism, excess, and the darker, more indulgent temptations that mortals so often find themselves drawn toward. It's also worth noting that the relationship between mortals and the Daedric princes is rarely as simple as pure worship or pure opposition. Across nearly every era we've covered tonight, ordinary mortals, adventurers, cultists, desperate rulers, and curious scholars alike have struck bargains with these princes, trading service or sacrifice for power, knowledge, or protection, and the results of those bargains ripple across this entire history in ways both subtle and enormous. The tribunal's own rise to power, as we discussed earlier, was shaped in part by their relationship with Azura's displeasure and eventual involvement in the Nerevarine prophecy. The very existence of vampirism and lycanthropy across Tamriel traces directly back to Molag Bal and Hircine respectively. Even the philosophy driving the mythic Dawn cult during the Oblivion Crisis was, at its core, an act of devotion to Mehrunes Dagon. The princes may stand outside the sacrifice that built Mundus, but their fingerprints are pressed into nearly every chapter of mortal history we've traced tonight, a constant, patient presence lingering just beyond the edge of the world the Aedra built. Each of these princes, in their own way, represents an eternal, unchanging aspect of existence that chose, at the dawn of everything, not to fracture itself in service of Lorkhan's grand experiment, and in a strange way, their continued presence throughout every era of this story, tempting, testing, occasionally aiding the mortal heroes we've followed tonight, serves as a constant reminder of the two paths that were available at the very beginning of time. The Aedra chose sacrifice and diminishment in exchange for creation. The Daedra chose to remain exactly as they always were. Neither path was without cost, and it's mortals, born from that ancient split, who have spent every single age since caught somewhere in between, and that tonight is the complete story of the Elder Scrolls, or at least as complete a version as anyone, mortal or otherwise, has ever managed to piece together. From the collision of Anu and Padomay in the formless dark before time existed, through Lorkhan's broken heart and Magnus's fleeing wound in the sky, through the long, slow splintering of the Aldmer into Aldmer and Bosmer and Chimere and Falmer, through the vanishing of an entire Dwemer civilization beneath a mountain, through Alessia's rebellion and Tiber Septim's ascension into godhood, through the gates of oblivion tearing open across Cyrodiil, through a great war fought over the legitimacy of a single god, and finally through a lone Dragonborn standing atop a mountain, ending a threat that had been waiting patiently since the very oldest days of Nordic legend. If there's one thread that ties every single piece of this enormous story together, it's sacrifice. Lorkhan sacrificed his own divinity to build a world. The Aedra sacrificed their perfect, unchanging existence for something that could grow and struggle and eventually die. Martin Septim sacrificed himself to seal a breach that would have consumed everything. And every hero we've walked alongside tonight, in ways large and small, has echoed that same ancient pattern, giving up something of themselves so that the world, this strange, wounded, endlessly resilient world, could keep turning for one more age. Think back for a moment across everything we've walked through together tonight. A formless void giving rise to two clashing forces, a broken god burying his own heart beneath a mountain so that a world could exist at all. Elves splintering into a dozen proud, wounded cultures, each certain their path was the righteous one. An entire civilization of dwarves reaching so far past the boundaries of mortal ambition that they simply cease to exist. Slaves rising up to overthrow their masters, only to build an empire that would, centuries later, calcify into the same rigid cruelty it once stood against. A man becoming a god, and that same god's legitimacy becoming the spark for a war that shattered an empire. A mountain finally releasing the fury it had held back for thousands of years, scattering an entire people across the continent as refugees, and finally, at the very end of everything we've covered tonight, one more mortal, marked by dragon blood, standing on a frozen mountaintop, closing a chapter of destruction that had been quietly waiting in the wings since the oldest days of Nordic legend. It's a lot to hold in your head all at once, and if pieces of it are already slipping away as your eyes grow heavier, that's all right. That's exactly what this was built for. I hope tonight's journey helped carry you somewhere quiet. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me through the whole thing, and if you drifted off somewhere around the Dwemer or the Oblivion Crisis, that's alright too. That's exactly what these videos are here for. Wherever in the world you're listening from tonight, I hope you sleep well and wake up rested. If you enjoyed this one, it would genuinely mean a lot if you subscribed to Nightfall Lore and left a comment letting me know which chapter of Tamriel's history you'd want covered in even more depth next time, because this was very much the broad overview, and there are entire hidden rooms in this history we've barely touched tonight. Until next time, rest well, Dragonborn.